There was a time when candy didn't come from glossy supermarket aisles but from country kitchens, paper sacks at the general store, and front porch hands dusted in sugar. In the 1970s, across rural America, homemade sweets and humble store-bought treats carried stories of hard work, church socials, and summer evenings under fading light. These were hill country candies, simple, stubborn, unforgettable. Peanut brittle snapped like dry twigs, molasses taffy pulled for hours, and chocolate drops hid in glass jars by the counter. Today, most have quietly vanished. But their sweetness still lingers in memory, waiting to be tasted again. Molasses pull candy. Long before factory-made sweets filled convenience store shelves, molasses pull candy was the pride of many rural kitchens. In the 1970s, especially across Appalachian towns and southern farming communities, this dark, glossy confection was less a purchase and more a ritual. It began with a heavy pot on the stove, where molasses simmered slowly with sugar and a splash of vinegar. The scent alone, deep, smoky, almost bittersweet, could drift through an entire house. When the syrup reached just the right stage, it was poured onto buttered pans and left to cool just enough to handle. Then came the real work. Candy pulling wasn't a solitary task. Children and parents would gather, greasing their hands with butter before stretching and folding the thick ribbon over and over again. With each pull, the color lightened from dark brown to a golden tan, and the texture transformed from sticky mass to silky firmness. It was science disguised as tradition. Once ready, the candy was twisted into ropes and cut into bite-sized pieces. The flavor wasn't overly sweet. It carried the bold earthiness of molasses, a reminder of older times when sugar was precious and nothing went to waste. It was the kind of treat that lasted, tucked into tins or wrapped in wax paper. By the late 1970s, convenience candies began replacing these homemade rituals. Store shelves offered bright wrappers and uniform shapes, while molasses pull candy slowly faded from everyday life. Today, few remember the arm-aching joy of pulling it by hand. But for those who do, the taste is inseparable from laughter in warm kitchens and the rhythm of country living. Peanut brittle. On winter evenings in the 1970s, when wood stoves crackled and wind rattled thin window panes, peanut brittle often took center stage in rural kitchens. It wasn't fancy, and it certainly wasn't soft. Peanut brittle announced itself with a sharp snap the moment you broke it apart. That sound alone meant something sweet was coming. The recipe was straightforward: sugar, a splash of water, light corn syrup, and raw peanuts stirred steadily in a heavy cast iron skillet. Timing was everything. The mixture had to reach the perfect amber shade, too pale and it tasted flat, too dark and it carried a bitter edge. A spoonful of baking soda at the end created tiny bubbles, giving the brittle its delicate, airy crunch. Once poured onto a buttered sheet, it spread thin and hardened quickly, locking the peanuts in a golden glass. In many hill country homes, brittle wasn't just holiday food. It was made after harvest, during church gatherings, or whenever extra peanuts were on hand. Families stored it in metal tins lined with wax paper, stacked carefully so it wouldn't shatter too soon. Children learned patience by waiting for it to cool, hovering nearby despite warnings about hot sugar. By the late 70s, mass-produced candy bars and packaged snacks slowly replaced these homemade sheets of sweetness. Store-bought versions lacked the smoky depth that came from cooking sugar over real flame. The ritual of stirring, watching, and listening for that perfect crackle began disappearing from daily life. Today, peanut brittle survives mostly as a seasonal novelty, rarely made from scratch. But those who grew up with it remember more than its flavor. They remember the warmth of crowded kitchens and the pride of breaking off a perfect, shining piece. Divinity candy. There was something almost magical about divinity candy in the 1970s. In rural homes across the South and Appalachia, this cloud-like confection felt delicate compared to heavier country sweets. Yet making it required strength, patience, and perfect timing. Divinity was known to fail without warning, and that risk made success even sweeter. The recipe relied on simple ingredients: sugar, light corn syrup, egg whites, and a splash of vanilla. But the real secret wasn't written on recipe cards. It was whispered advice passed between generations. Never make divinity on a humid day. Wait for clear skies and cool air. Moisture in the atmosphere could turn glossy peaks into sticky disappointment. Hot syrup was poured slowly into stiffly beaten egg whites while someone mixed steadily, sometimes by hand with a wooden spoon. The transformation happened quickly. What began as thin syrup thickened into a bright white mass, losing its shine and gaining body with every turn. Chopped pecans were folded in at the last moment, adding texture and a gentle nuttiness. Dropped by spoonfuls onto wax paper, divinity held soft swirls on top like little snowdrifts. It wasn't overly sweet in a harsh way. Instead, it melted slowly on the tongue, airy and smooth, dissolving into vanilla warmth. In the 70s, divinity often appeared at Christmas, church suppers, and family reunions. It was displayed proudly on platters beside fudge and brittle, signaling that someone in the kitchen truly knew their craft. But as electric mixers replaced hand beating and store shelves filled with packaged marshmallow candies, fewer people bothered with such a temperamental recipe. Today, divinity is rarely made outside the holidays. Yet for those who remember, it carries the memory of careful hands, quiet kitchens, and the simple triumph of getting it just right. Sorghum taffy. Before bright neon candies lined gas station racks, sorghum taffy stretched across farmhouse kitchens like golden rope. In the 1970s, especially in Appalachian and Southern Hill communities, sorghum syrup was more common than refined sugar. Families grew it, pressed it, boiled it down, and used it in everything from biscuits to candy. Sorghum taffy began with that thick, dark syrup poured into a heavy pot with sugar and a touch of butter. As it simmered, it released a deep, toasted aroma, earthy, almost smoky, nothing like the clean sweetness of white sugar. The mixture had to be watched carefully, stirred slow and steady until it reached the right temperature. Too cool and it stayed sticky. Too hot and it hardened beyond pulling. When ready, the hot syrup was poured onto a greased surface and left just long enough to handle. Then came the pulling. Hands buttered, arms working in rhythm. The candy was stretched and folded again and again. Each pull lightened its color from dark amber to a soft golden tan. Air folded into the mixture, turning dense syrup into chewy strands. Children often begged to help, even though the work made shoulders ache. Pulling taffy was part labor, part laughter. It wasn't unusual for neighbors to gather, especially during cooler months, turning candy making into a small event. By the late 1970s, corn syrup-based candies and brightly wrapped caramels began replacing these homemade pulls. Sorghum, once a staple crop, slowly disappeared from everyday cooking. Today, few remember the bold flavor of sorghum taffy, rich, slightly bitter, and deeply rooted in the soil it came from. But for those who do, it tastes like harvest season and long evenings under open skies. Martha Washington candy. In many rural kitchens of the 1970s, Martha Washington candy felt like something special, even elegant, despite its simple country roots. No one seemed entirely sure who first named it, but the title gave these chocolate-dipped treats a sense of pride. They often appeared during holidays, weddings, and church bake sales, carefully arranged in paper cups like little treasures. The filling was rich and sweet. Butter, powdered sugar, shredded coconut, chopped pecans, and a splash of vanilla were mixed together into a thick dough. Sometimes a spoonful of condensed milk was added for smoothness. The mixture was rolled into small balls and chilled until firm. Each one was then dipped into melted chocolate, coating the pale center in a glossy shell. Unlike store-bought truffles, Martha Washington candies were slightly irregular. The chocolate might pool a little at the base or show faint streaks from hand dipping. But that imperfection was part of their charm. Every piece was handmade, shaped by familiar hands that knew the recipe by memory rather than measurement. In hill country towns, these candies were often wrapped in wax paper and tucked into tins to give as gifts. They symbolize generosity during times when money was tight but hospitality was strong. Offering a plate of Martha Washington's meant sharing effort, not just sugar. By the end of the 70s, boxed chocolates from supermarkets and national brands began replacing homemade assortments. Convenience slowly edged out tradition. Fewer families took the time to roll and dip dozens of candies by hand. Today, Martha Washington candy rarely appears outside of family recipe boxes passed down quietly. Yet those who remember them can still picture the glossy chocolate shell cracking gently, revealing a sweet coconut center that tasted like celebration and care. Potato candy. It may sound unusual today, but in many rural homes during the 1970s, potato candy was a treasured sweet. Born from thrift and necessity, this confection proved that even the humblest ingredients could become something memorable. In Appalachian kitchens especially, nothing went to waste, not even a leftover boiled potato. The recipe was surprisingly simple. A single mashed potato, still warm and smooth, was blended with powdered sugar until it formed a soft, workable dough. There was no butter, no eggs, no fancy additions. Just patience and sugar added cup by cup until the mixture lost its stickiness. The dough was then rolled thin across a sugared board. Next came the signature layer, a generous spread of creamy peanut butter brushed evenly over the surface. Once covered, the sheet was carefully rolled into a tight log, much like a jelly roll. After chilling, it was sliced into small spirals, revealing a pinwheel of pale dough and rich brown filling. Potato candy had a texture unlike anything sold in stores. It was soft yet slightly dense, dissolving gently on the tongue. The potato itself left no strong flavor, only a faint earthiness beneath the sweetness. Children often stared in disbelief when told what it was made from. In the 70s, this candy reflected the lingering mindset of earlier hard times. Recipes were built from what families already had in the pantry. But as processed sweets became cheaper and more accessible, fewer people saw the need to turn potatoes into dessert. Today, potato candy feels almost mythical to younger generations. Yet for those who grew up with it, each peanut butter swirl carries memories of resourceful hands and kitchens where creativity mattered more than cost. Rock candy on a stick. In the 1970s, a jar of rock candy on a stick could transform an ordinary kitchen into something magical. Unlike modern candy bars, this treat required time, patience, and a little bit of science, a slow crystallization process that fascinated children and adults alike. In rural homes, especially across the South and Appalachia, it wasn't just a sweet, it was a tiny homemade spectacle. Making rock candy began with sugar, water, and sometimes a drop of food coloring. The sugar dissolved over heat until the syrup reached a perfect boil. Then, wooden sticks or strings were suspended in the syrup, left undisturbed for days as crystals slowly formed. Families often used jars set on windowsills, sunlight glinting through sugary growths like tiny diamonds. Watching the crystals expand became part of the fun, a lesson in patience as much as dessert making. The finished candy was simple yet mesmerizing, clear, sparkling crystals clinging to a stick, ready to be licked or nibbled. Its sweetness was pure and intense, but the texture was crunchy, breaking satisfyingly with each bite. Children would sometimes compete to see who could grow the largest crystals, turning a simple treat into a playful experiment. By the late 1970s, commercially produced lollipops and candy sticks began replacing homemade versions. The convenience of brightly wrapped, ready-to-eat candies edged out the slow, delicate process of crystal growing at home. Many families stopped making rock candy entirely, relegating it to fairs or science projects. Yet for those who remember, the treat carries more than sweetness. Each stick evokes long afternoons of watching crystals form, the gentle hum of a country kitchen, and the quiet pride of having created something magical with patience, sugar, and a little time. Rock candy wasn't just food, it was wonder crystallized. Cinnamon hard candy. In the 1970s, cinnamon hard candy was a staple on many kitchen counters, especially in hill country homes where store-bought sweets were occasional luxuries. These fiery red discs packed a punch far stronger than their size suggested. They weren't just candy, they were tiny bursts of warmth that could chase away winter chills or soothe a scratchy throat. Making them was an art that demanded precision. Granulated sugar, water, and a dash of cream of tartar were boiled until the mixture reached the hard crack stage. Cinnamon oil or extract was added at the very end, releasing a fragrant, spicy aroma that filled the kitchen. The hot syrup was poured onto greased surfaces and allowed to cool just enough to handle. Then it was stretched, twisted, and cut into individual discs or sticks. These candies were prized for their long shelf life. Families stored them in jars or tins, keeping them on hand for guests, children returning from school, or travelers passing through. Each bite offered an immediate warmth and a lingering tingle, a reminder of simpler times and kitchens where ingredients were measured by eye and instinct rather than scales and timers. By the end of the 1970s, mass-produced peppermint and cinnamon candies dominated store shelves, offering convenience but lacking the handmade quality and personal touch of homemade discs. Fewer households bothered to make them from scratch, and many recipes quietly disappeared. Yet cinnamon hard candy remains vivid in memory. For those who grew up with it, the first sharp, spicy bite recalls chilly winter evenings, the smell of sugar boiling on the stove, and the gentle hum of family kitchens. It was more than candy, it was a taste of home, fiery, sweet, and unforgettable. Walnut whips. In the 1970s, walnut whips were a small luxury in many rural American homes, a candy that seemed fancier than most homemade treats yet remained approachable enough to make at home. These confections combined creamy, nutty centers with a crisp chocolate shell, offering a perfect balance of texture and flavor. In hill country kitchens, they were often made for special occasions, holidays, birthdays, or Sunday church socials. The process began with the filling. Sugar, butter, and egg whites were whipped together into a soft, fluffy mass. Chopped walnuts or pecans were folded in carefully, providing crunch amidst the creamy base. Shaping required patience. Small dollops were piped or hand-rolled into elongated mounds, each meant to sit snugly inside a chocolate cup. The chocolate itself was melted over gentle heat, then used to coat the nutty centers completely. Tempering the chocolate was tricky. Too warm and it lost its shine, too cool and it cracked unevenly. Once set, walnut whips were usually stored in tins, sometimes shared with neighbors or wrapped as gifts. Children were often allowed only one at a time, savoring the contrast of smooth chocolate and nutty interior. The candy wasn't overly sweet. The nuts balanced richness with a hint of earthiness, making each bite satisfying yet restrained. By the late 1970s, industrially produced chocolates, uniform and glossy, began flooding local stores. Handmade walnut whips gradually faded from everyday kitchens. Recipes lingered in memory or in dog-eared cookbooks, passed down quietly between generations. Today, walnut whips rarely appear outside specialty candy shops or nostalgic recreations. But for those who remember, they evoke more than flavor: the sound of chocolate cracking, the smell of nuts roasting, and the quiet pride of crafting something delicate by hand. It was a candy that combined patience, skill, and a sense of celebration, small treasures of sweetness from a simpler, slower era. Maple cream candy. In the 1970s, maple cream candy held a special place in kitchens across rural America, especially in the northern and hill country regions where maple syrup was more than a treat, it was a way of life. Families tapped trees in early spring, boiled the sap down to golden syrup, and turned a portion into creamy, dreamy confections that would last for months. Maple cream candy wasn't flashy, but its smooth, rich flavor made it unforgettable. Making it required patience and careful attention. Pure maple syrup was heated slowly, reaching the softball stage, then removed from heat and stirred continuously until it thickened to a silky consistency. Some families added a touch of butter or cream to enhance texture, But the true magic came from stirring by hand, watching it transform from liquid to a luscious, spreadable paste. Once ready, the candy was poured into molds or rolled into small squares, allowed to cool, and often wrapped in wax paper for storage. Children watched the process with fascination, eager to taste the warm, sticky syrup as it thickened. It was a communal experience. Stirring often involved siblings and parents together, laughing over sticky fingers and teasing over who got the first piece. Maple cream candy was more than a sweet treat. It was a seasonal celebration, a marker of spring's arrival and the hard work of tapping and boiling sap. By the late 1970s, commercially made maple-flavored candies and cheaper sugar-based sweets began replacing these homemade creations. The labor-intensive process was skipped in favor of convenience, and the tradition faded from most kitchens. Yet for those who remember, maple cream candy carries the warmth of family kitchens, the aroma of boiling sap, and the slow, satisfying rhythm of hands stirring sugar into gold. It's a flavor that speaks of patience, heritage, and the quiet joy of crafting sweetness from the very heart of the forest. These 10 forgotten hillbilly candies from the 1970s remind us that sweetness once came with patience, family, and a touch of magic. Each treat tells a story of kitchens warmed by stoves, children with sticky fingers, and recipes passed down through generations. While many have vanished from store shelves, their flavors live on in memory, evoking nostalgia for a simpler time when candy was handmade with care. Revisiting these lost sweets lets us taste history itself, a reminder that the small joys of the past are worth remembering, and maybe even bringing back one recipe at a time.